I am so excited to introduce the first product tank of 2023. So we're broadcasting live from YouTube today. So make sure to say hi in the comment box at the right-hand side of your screen and just let us know where you're watching from as well. So I know it's not really the same as being there in person, sadly, but we do try to make these sessions as interactive as possible. So leave any comments or questions that you have for our guest speaker, Adrian Howard, as we go, rather than just putting it in the Q&A or they might get missed. So one of the things that I wanted to bring up was our next meetup. So it's reducing risk through lean experimentation. So sadly, it didn't go as planned. I think it was about 8 months ago this was supposed to run. And sadly, a couple of days before I was supposed to facilitate the session and sadly ended up in hospital. And then I had a baby about 4 weeks later. So we're ready to have this. Like the time is right. We're going to have it next month. And we're going to look at opportunity mapping. We're going to look at experimentation and the different types of pivots as well. So it's going to be a great interactive in-person session. So I'm looking forward to that as well. But without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Adrian Howard. He's coach at Quiet Stars and works with companies of all different sizes, combining team coaching and teaching with hands-on product work. He has over 25 years experience working with establishing businesses, agencies and startups, and he's an active member of Agile, Balanced Team and Lean UX communities. And he's always sort of teaching and speaking on integrating products, lean UX and agile methods. And today he's going to talk to us about some of the biases that prevent us from working well together across different disciplines and how we can overcome that as well. So take it away, Adrian. Go for it.
Hello. Let me find where my slides are. Hello, welcome. Nice to tune in. I hate the 25 years of experience thing now because that just makes me feel old. I'm going to take that out of my bio. Couple of things before I start rambling at you. First, if you find that having a man in a tiny window presenting at you where you can't pause or shut him up annoying, then the slides and transcript of the talk are also over at quietstars.com/Sturgeons-biases. If the information is easier for you to absorb that way, go there and come back here for the QA. I can't see you. I wouldn't even know. Second, I just want to give you a couple of seconds to think about a time you had a really good experience or a really bad experience working with someone in a different community of practice. Don't worry, I'm not going to call you out and ask you to do stuff, but I'd like you to have a think about whatever story you remember at the end of the talk. Enough preamble. I'd like you to meet Theodore Sturgeon. For those who don't already know, Theodore was a science fiction author. He wrote over 100 short stories, 11 novels, and a bunch of Star Trek scripts, including the classic original Trek episode Amok Time, if we have any fans in the audience. But he's arguably as well known for some things he wrote in Venture magazine in 1958 about the many criticisms science fiction got from people who didn't like the genre. This is what he said. Sturgeon's revelation, which was wrung out of me after 20 years of wearying defence of science fiction against attacks of people who used the worst examples of the field for ammunition, and whose conclusion was that 90% of SF is crud. The revelation, 90% of everything is crud. And people started calling this revelation Sturgeons Law. 90% of everything is crud. Sometimes folk use other harsher words instead of crud. In the last few years, I've found Sturgeon's Law to be a useful lens to help me understand some of the problems I encounter when different communities of practice start butting heads. When developers rant about how terrible product managers are, when product managers say that Agile is awful, when Agile folk hate on designers, and so on. I work coaching leaders and managers who are struggling in the messy spaces where strategy and research and delivery overlap. So I see folk butting heads a lot. And a lot of that conflict seems to happen because of a couple of biases around how different communities of practice perceive each other. And I've been calling them Sturgeons biases because they're caused by people forgetting that Sturgeons Law applies to groups and people too. As an aside, if you discover a better label for this, do let me know. This kind of really feels like the sort of problem some smart sociologist would have written a paper about 70 years ago, but I've not been able to find anything yet. Anyway. Imagine a community with 100 people in it. They can be developers or product managers or lawyers. It doesn't matter. Let's say they're product managers, like most of you. Now, in any community of practice, some people are going to be awesome practitioners and some folk are going to be less awesome, along with everything in between. But for the sake of simplicity, let's use Sturgeon's Law. So our green 10% are our awesome folk, which makes the other 90% crud. Which makes a kind of intuitive sense. If I look around in an organization or a community, there are going to be some folk who are better at a thing and some folk who are worse at a thing, whether that's through leadership or management or training or exposure to good practices or just raw ability. And this seems to be the model that many people have on how communities of practice are broken down. A random distribution of ability levels. The problem is that this picture's a lie. Because the distribution of people in a community of practice isn't random. Good people in a field tend to seek out other good people. They tend to hire other good people. They tend to talk more to other good people. They cluster. They also tend to either raise up folk near them through influence and education, or push them away if those other people can't or don't want to work in the same way as they do. Which means that the best practitioners in a community of practice get a really, really biased view of the general level of ability in that community. They only see the people around them who all tend to be awesome or awesome adjacent. They work in the same way as they do. They have the same values as them. Whereas the majority of people in that community see this. The best people in the community experience it as 90% awesome, when the reality is 10% awesome. And that's the first of what I've been calling Sturgeon's biases. The best people in a community experience 90% awesome, when the reality is 10% awesome. For example, the first 10 years or so of my career, I hated testers, which is dumb, I know. But the reason I hated testers is that all the testers I worked with were pretty terrible at testing. They were very old school. There was no automated testing. There was very much running through a checklist that somebody else wrote. Very little independent action on problems or looking at underlying causes. My favourite example of this was there was a curse word in some copy that got into the product. And this was in the era when we were shipping stuff on floppy disks, so change was hard, it really mattered. And this curse word got seen but not called out by one of the people in the testing group because it wasn't on the checklist. Anyway, this isn't the only bias. All the voices in a community of practice are not equally prominent. Who speaks at the conferences? Who writes the articles? Who works on the more exciting and influential projects? We hear the voices of some people much, much more frequently. They have much, much more visibility than everybody else. We don't tend to get conference keynotes about work that went terribly wrong and everybody walked away learning no lessons. Which leads to the second bias. The presentation of a community is 90% awesome when the reality is 10% awesome. And that dissonance causes problems. If the world tells you that something is brilliant and your own experiences of it are terrible, then you tend to dismiss that story about the good thing as a lie. If somebody tells you Scrum is awesome and your only experience of it is as a process-heavy, estimate-driven, velocity-chasing feature factory, then it's hard to take them seriously. If somebody tells you product management is awesome and your only experience of it is somebody repeatedly hitting you over the head with a heavy product requirements document folder, then it's hard to take them seriously. Now, these biases are a massive oversimplification. People don't neatly fall into two categories of awesome and crud. Those 10% and 90% proportions, probably wrong. They've just been made up. There's fairly obviously a continuum there, not a kind of either or thing. Ability is certainly not fixed. People improve through training and experience. People can get worse when the world changes around them and they don't change their practices and methods. Individual ability and ability to take action is often constrained by external factors. If your company doesn't support professional development and training, or it doesn't give you any new experiences, or it only works in one domain, then you're not going to improve and get better, and that's not the individual's fault. Popular communities attract newbies and exploiters, which can change the proportions and the values of a community very quickly when it gets popular. For example, machine learning right now, there's a massive influx of new people, and it's popular. And that's why there's a massive influx, and not all of those people have all the skills and all the knowledge to do that work well. And there's other communities who see that popularity and come in and want to extract value with, I don't know, certification or training or something like that, and not necessarily add value back in. And communities of practice are fuzzy and fractal. There isn't a neat border around 100 people, and that is product management. It's a messy domain which overlaps with other messy domains and has a bunch of sub-disciplines and sub-domains. There are no clear borders around things. And yet, I see problems all the time. Somebody dismissing Agile as never working is seen as an idiot by people who see it working all the time. That new user researcher is ignored by the product manager because every other researcher that product manager has worked with has given them useless, unactionable reports. A CTO expects product managers to be machines for turning client requests into user stories because that's all that CTO has experienced from people with that job title. Design thinking is seen as snake oil because people have only ever experienced kind of post-it note theatre under that title that never led to anything useful. These are all problems I've encountered, and Sturgeon's biases have helped me understand why they happen. It's really easy for somebody in the awesome bubble to have never seen the bad. It's really easy for somebody outside the awesome bubble to have never seen the good. So, how do we start addressing that when you hit this situation? A few tips that I found useful. Pause for a sip of water. Never dismiss a lived experience. Actually listen to what people tell you and believe them, even when you're hearing something that kind of goes against stuff you know. Remember me hating testers, which was stupid. In the late 90s, I got to work with an awesome tester who turned that around. And he didn't turn that around by saying, "You're an idiot, testing is good." He turned that around by listening to my experiences, telling me, yeah, that sounds kind of sucky, before he started with the, "That's not what good testing is. Here, let me show you the good stuff." He listened first and he believed me. Second, ask for stories. That excellent tester also asked me for stories about my experiences. Can you tell me the last time you shipped something with QA? What happened? Can you tell me how testing affected that result? Can you tell me about your last experience doing this? Those stories helped him understand where I was coming from and what my experiences were, so that he could help move me to a better place and a better understanding of how good testers and good QA practices worked. Third, talk about outcomes first. In discussions about good and bad practice, wide, to talk about process and not the reasons for doing the process. For example, a while back I was working with somebody who hated Scrum for very, very good reasons. He'd worked in some terrible environments that were doing Scrum very badly, and it sucked, and it was a horrible experience. But the place he worked now wasn't using Scrum and was having a few problems. It was, for various reasons, a rapidly changing environment. People were working really hard individually on things, and they weren't quite in sync on the work that they were doing. They thought everybody was aligned at the start of the day, but stuff happened. People heard slightly different messages. So there was a little bit of waste and a little bit of rework that didn't need to happen, or the wrong work happening. By talking about the outcomes that he wanted, things like we want to be synced, we want to make sure everyone knows where we are at the start of the day, and so on, they ended up adding a short meeting to the start of every working day where everybody talked about what they were trying to get out of that day and what they were trying to do and what was blocking them. He basically reinvented the Scrum stand-up, though he would never in a million years have called it that. A meeting from a process he hated, because he talked about the outcomes that he wanted from that first and then worked forward from there to solutions. Next, using different words is surprisingly powerful. If somebody has had a terrible experience doing work that's been labelled a certain way, it's really hard to use that label without bringing those experiences back. For example, I worked with somebody who had a thing described as service blueprints, and the thing that they were doing actually wasn't service blueprints. It was closer to customer journey mapping, and that done very badly at that. And so they hated service blueprints. So we just used a different word instead. I hit this one a bunch with user research. A lot of folk have only experienced user research as a slow and expensive process that's a little bit distant from kind of product work. And so when people like that hear user research, what they actually hear is slow and expensive and not very useful. But if insight gathering your own lived experiences. Which bubbles are you living in? Are most of your experience of delivery in that awesome bubble? Are most of your experiences of product management in that crud bubble? How do you find out? Think about what Sturgeon's biases might be saying about where you work now. Talking of Theodore, in his Venture magazine article, he talked about two corollaries. I can never say the word. Corollaries to his revelation. First, the existence of immense quantities of trash in science fiction is admitted and is regrettable, but is no more unnatural than the existence of trash anywhere. So, don't feel bad about the 90% of crud in your domain. Fiction is as good as the best fiction in any field. So, don't forget the awesome bits of your domain that are still pretty darn awesome. I hope keeping Sturgeon's biases in mind will help you find the awesome in where you had that really good or really bad experience working with somebody with a different community of practice. The Sturgeon's biases affect how you think about that story now. Thank you for your attention. A reminder that you can review the deck and transcript over at choirstars.com/sturgeons-biases if you want to. We also have an awesome newsletter that we're restarting after its pandemic hiatus, if you'd like to subscribe. And we're open to questions now. But if you have questions or feedback that you're not comfortable talking about live, don't hesitate to get in touch. I'm Adrian H in most places, and feedback is a gift. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adrian. That was great. It was really interesting to get that perspective. You know, I actually had never heard of Sturgeon's biases before, and now I'm starting to think, you know, I need to think a little bit about self-awareness even in my own part. But yeah, so there's been like a few questions coming through. So an interesting one I thought was, what was your worst experience of Sturgeon's bias, and how did you overcome it?
That's interesting. Let me think. Too many. I don't know if it's the worst. Like, one that comes up a bunch is still sadly that that UX and design stereotype of design is here to make the thing pretty. I once worked with an organization that was having a bunch of miscellaneous problems, but a bunch of those problems were to do with the kind of the usability of their product. And fundamentally, they had one UX person for half a dozen design teams because they thought it was about having the right colors and the right buttons, and this poor overworked person was not able to do all of the things that was involved in making that better. And that was a long process of helping them see the pain point of the fact that it wasn't just a person pushing Figma or Photoshop to make things better. So we did that in various ways. We helped them talk to some peers in different organizations about how design worked there, and how there was a presence of design much higher up in the org chart than there was in this particular company, and the kinds of things that needed to happen to make that work with both development teams and with their nascent product group, because they had problems with product as well, but that's a different story. There was we helped some with the process of hiring and getting some more design leadership higher up in the organization, and then they were able to both push for more design resources further down on the teams, and they grew that group very quickly. And they also helped then, because they were further up in the organization, they could more easily kind of explain and show the value of like the non-graphic design aspects of design to more people higher up in the organization, so that they started building a little bit more of a user research arm.
Oh, very good.
Hopefully that answers the question, but yes.
Yeah, 100%. Like, I mean, even if anyone's been to like a lean coffee around here recently, I think that was a huge talk, has been some of the biases towards design, for instance, and people's different opinions. And it is interesting, like trying to draw out those stories to kind of go, how have you overcome this? And like being able to take kind of inspiration from that is really great.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good general solution. Is if you can find people that they respect who work in a different way, and getting them to talk is really valuable.
Exactly, and it's like people that they respect makes a lot of sense as well, because it's sometimes you can be saying the same words, but it doesn't quite break through. But even like Connor here was saying that it was really useful for life in general and not just for products. But like that is one quite, does it apply to all communities?
I think there's definitely edges of that too. I mean, I guess I spend most of my working life in the digital spaces. I have seen slightly similar things in. I did some work with some local government, for example, and they were actually no better example. I work with a university research group, and they were having problems getting the stuff from their research area acted on from policy people, so kind of government. And then there was a lot of assumptions about what the other group valued, and there were lots of to oversimplify. They were seeing the research group was seeing the government group as people who only needed to be convinced this answer was right, sort of thing. And so the research group was kind of, okay, we'll do this research again, but to like another decimal point of precision, so they'll really believe it this time. Whereas the government group were, we don't have the money or resources to act on this policy. You're giving us a research result that we can't actually use in any meaningful way, and they were continually talking past each other because they were making assumptions about the other side's value system. And again, getting them to talk, getting them to start telling stories to each other, helped make that a slightly more productive conversation.
It's like being in one of those war rooms, trying to reach a compromise. But yeah, I suppose like you've kind of touched a little bit there on like there's people have their own biases, but you touched a little bit on being self-aware of our own assumptions that we're making as well. Like, is that something we should be more proactively doing? I mean, in product, we're always doing assumptions mapping, whereas are we questioning our own assumptions? Should we be doing that more?
Yes, I think it is the short and indeed the long answer. It's something I hit a lot with, and it always surprises me when I see it with people, because product people and user research people are both people whose practice is based around kind of doing discovery work, doing research, understanding what the underlying causes are. And yet I see people in those domains making an assumption about their co-workers and the people they work with, and getting them to start like, the people who work with me get very, very tired of hearing me say things like, are there any other possible explanations for that behavior? Because it's getting people to come up with, okay, you're seeing this thing that you like or don't like, come up with like 3 different reasons for that happening, and then start coming up with some, okay, how do we figure out which of those reasons is the right reason? Having that approach to the work you do with your co-workers and your organization, as much as you do your end users and your product, is super valuable. And this isn't my story, but I had a lovely chat with a woman a few years back who had built little jobs to be done profiles of her co-workers and her peers in the organization. So she had a little kind of reminder of what their values were and what they were trying to do and the job they were trying to get done. And, you know, she shared those with people and double checked them and things like that. And I thought that was a really interesting thing to do for a product person to do with other people in her organization.
Well, yeah, like I've done something similar to that before, where you kind of have 10 questions that you send out to everyone, and you're kind of like, how would you like to be approached when there's a problem? Or, you know, how do you react in these kinds of situations? And then you kind of have a little profile on everyone, so then you can kind of go, oh, maybe I've misinterpreted this situation. Which is, people feel like it's a lot of work up front, but I always thought it was worth it, especially when you're starting out in a new team and things like that.
Very much so.
But yes, so as well, you were kind of mentioning about that 90%. So there's the 90% of people, like, we all like to think we fall into the 10% of awesome people. But the statistics are very much against us. So it's kind of like, well, what if I am part of that 90%? Like, the chances are that I am. It means that all the awesome people aren't gravitating towards me. I don't really know what good looks like. So, like, a lot of kind of working with biases is being like, I'm going to just show them how amazing I am. And I know, you know, I know exactly how to work around this problem, and I'm very valuable. Well, what if I'm not valuable, but I want to be? You know, what do I do?
I think that thing you talked about earlier of coming up with options and questioning things is super valuable, and finding places to experiment and validate or invalidate those things in a safe-ish way is really valuable. I mean, to pick a personal story, I first came across kind of agile stuff on the C2 wiki in '99, I think it was, where they were talking about extreme programming and stuff like that. And I thought this was sheer nonsense, and all these people were frauds, charlatans, fools and or charlatans, because much of the stuff that it talked about went against many of the ways that I'd been kind of building software previously. And what I found, and coincidentally, there was a little bit of that I wanted to try, which was test-driven development, which I didn't think would actually work, but would, I think, useful to help me get better at automated testing at that point, which was something I wanted to do. And I tried that one little safe thing, and that worked, which led me to trying something else, which also worked, which led me to talking to other people who were doing this sort of thing, and like listening to their stories about what did or didn't work for them and where it was valuable. And that led me to discover the good bits of those space and move from a fairly waterfall model of software development to a much more iterative model of software development. So look for little things that you can try that may be a bit out of your comfort zone, and talking to people who are having good experiences with those methods are two things that I found useful.
Okay, brilliant. That's really valuable. And a related question came through. How do I know if I'm in the 10%? Okay, how do I know that I'm awesome?
Well, again, it's talking to me. And again, this is something I find interesting. Is there's so much value in talking to people in other companies and other organizations, not just at like an individual level, but you know, that's taking a few people for, like that thing I talked about earlier. You know, we took the company that wasn't doing great on the design side. we took a whole bunch of people from the design suite and we did a little tour of a couple of different other companies that we could build a nice relationship with, and like, this is what their design people do, and this is the valuable stuff that happens, and this is the things that we've seen. And they could then start seeing that work in practice in real life, and see that it wasn't just kind of, a bullshit story from Forbes or something. It was something that they could see in practice working. So I think that's the thing that helps you figure out if you're in that 10 or 90%, which are, I iterate, just made up numbers. It's not really that. It's just an illustrative example. But the thing that helps is actively looking for things that contradict your worldview, and looking for options and ways to explore those things with people who do things in a different way.
And then Paul has asked, are technical people more likely to be guilty of biases against less technical people?
I think both sides are equally crappy. Possibly about different things. Well, very definitely about different things. I think, for example, I regularly see kind of people in certain technical communities to be very biased against management, especially middle management. Because they do not perceive the value that it is providing to the system, mostly because the value that it provides is often in a space that they never interact with. Vice versa, I sometimes see people in management making assumptions about people in development, that they kind of give them a task and they do the task and they don't care about the strategy stuff, which again leads to horrible things. You have kind of, management only cares about kind of dates and features and estimates, which is stupid. From the delivery side, management are going kind of, we can't explain strategy to developers, so we'll just have to give them these arbitrary dates and lists of features to do. And it's not until you get the two groups together and talking that you can start bridging that gap, and kind of, look, if you explain the strategy, then developers can give you many more options on routes to explore to help do that, and they can start applying that in a more iterative way, which gives you more direction than wrong estimates will give you, and both sides can start getting much more value happening.
So just accept that you're all important and stop being so insecure. But you touched on like an interesting point that there's not really any keynotes about where things went wrong. Everyone walked away learning no lessons type of thing. So it's really like, should we be given more of a platform to the other 90%? Because I know I've sat through a lot of talks and I'm thinking, I don't see how this can practically, like, in my environment work.
I mean, there's a whole thing in science about publication bias, which is when you have kind of research around an area, the thing that gets published is the thing that shows a result, and the boring experiments where something fails never get talked about. I love oh Lord, the man's name is escaping me right this second. There's a lovely practice that I borrowed from a gentleman whose name has left my head this second, called failure swap shops, which is it's kind of bit of a glitter, but kind of it's Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, but for failure stories. It's like, hi, my name's Adrian and I failed, and you tell a story about how you messed something up, and some lessons that are learned from that. I will post a little URL somewhere and remind myself who wrote that. But yeah, I think talking about failure is massively valuable. We don't do that enough, and I think that's very hard, because it's one of those things that is, I think, difficult for people to do in a totally public forum because faith, failure as a status thing is something that's quite hard to talk about at times. Also, failure often talks about things inside your organization that you don't really want to talk about. And finding more private, safer spaces for that is, I think, a good thing to look for. I think that, again, finding spaces where people from different organizations and from different levels and different disciplines can get together to talk about things in private is a space where you can sometimes get access to those more interesting stories about stuff working well or stuff working badly. That is Luke Williams. Thank you, David Curran, for telling me the name of the person I can't forget. Luke is going to kill me. But yeah, finding spaces where you can talk about failure without kind of risk of it blowing back on you is a good thing to look for.
Yeah, I love that idea. It might be one we'll pick up where we'll do the Alcoholics Anonymous or Product Anonymous, or it has to be that sort of small group, as you said, because if you do it in a big public forum where you're broadcasting it on YouTube, it's not really very fair. But
no.
but we definitely need to learn, because I know that every talk you go to, people go, you got to fail fast, but you're like, you know what that means? Do you mean, give me an example where you did?
That's really, I think that's fascinating, because I totally agree with you. That's what you hear. And I hear a lot of talk about experimentation and hypothesis stuff. I rarely, but the way you hear those stories, it's usually, we tried this thing and this experiment, and this experiment showed that it worked. And everything was awesome and we made lots of money and aren't we great? Whereas I find it much more interesting where you have these we tried these 8 different experiments and they all failed miserably because our strategy was rubbish. Then we had to change it, and we tried 4 more experiments and it still was rubbish. And then we tried another experiment and it kind of worked, and then we started moving from there. I think those stories are much more interesting, and you very, very rarely hear them told. It's like I work with a company, and they had these wonderful ideas for a mobile app for a certain bit of their business domain, and then they went and talked to 20 customers, and everybody hated it, so they didn't do it. And that's a story that never, in fact, I've had that happen in 2 different domains where we went and talked to a bunch of customers and they all said, no, I'm never going to do that, mate. And so the idea went away, which is fantastic, because they'd have spent £500,000 building those apps, and that £500,000 can now be spent off on something more useful instead. But hey, we tried something and it didn't work. Very rarely gets talked about.
Yeah, whereas saving $500,000 versus making $500,000, is there really a difference? So you're really making money when you think about it that way. But if anybody doesn't have any last minute questions, any final thoughts, Adrian?
Final thoughts. I really have made up the 90% and 10% thing, so don't take that seriously. but do take the idea that when people are telling you something does or doesn't work and it goes against your experiences, ask more questions. See if there are some assumptions there that you can break apart a little bit and look at in more detail, because there's usually something interesting happening there, even if it's a dysfunction that it's you're doing it this way because this other part of your organization is completely broken. Understanding that's still super valuable. and gives you lots of things. So don't just go, oh, that person's dumb because they're doing this dumb thing, or that person is lying because I tried to do this and it didn't work for me, and they're saying it's working. Understand why. Ask more questions. Question your own assumptions, and that's gonna help you figure out how things work more regularly.
I love it. Thank you so much, Adrian. This has been amazing. We've just loved having you on.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been delightful.